I teach Old Testament here at Asbury Theological Seminary, and sometimes when I say that to people, they look sort of skeptical, and they say, Old Testament, do we really need the Old Testament? I mean, we're Christians. The New Testament is a Christian book, and the Old Testament, I mean, that's a Jewish book. Yeah, that's where we got started, but really, the New Testament has kind of superseded the Old Testament, hasn't it? And even more than that, if they get really honest with me, they say, well, doesn't the New Testament correct the Old Testament? I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that's well, wrong. The Old Testament teaches us that we're saved by keeping the law, and the New Testament says, no, we're saved by grace. And the Old Testament, I mean, you got this God there who is really angry and mean, and the New Testament, you got God who loves people. And so, do we really need the Old Testament? And the answer is, yes, we do need the Old Testament. It's very interesting that this question about the appropriateness of the Old Testament for Christians surfaced as early as 180 years after Jesus, when you had a very saintly preacher who proposed, let's just get rid of the Old Testament and those parts of the New Testament that sort of reflect the Old Testament. And it didn't take the church long at all to say, no way. Because the Old Testament is a Christian book, they said. Now, why would they say that? Why would the earliest Christians say, you know what? Our Bible is not just 27 books, it's 66 books. Why would they say that? Well, partly because of Jesus and Paul, which are two pretty good reasons, aren't they? Jesus says to the Pharisees, you know what your problem is? You don't know the Bible well enough. And he's clearly talking about the Old Testament. Jesus says, I did not come to do away with the Old Testament. I came to fulfill it. What is he saying? He's saying the Old Testament asks some very key questions to which Jesus is the answer. And Paul says over and over again, if you want to understand what this Christian faith is about, you have to look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament God is the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So the early church, when they were challenged to say the Old Testament is really not Christian, said, no, it is too a Christian book. Now, what about, though, these questions of the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Well, first of all, let me say to you that the Old Testament does not teach that people are saved by keeping the law. People do not come into a saving relationship with God by being obedient to the law. They come into a saving relationship with God by grace. You say, really? Sure. How about Abraham? How much of the law did he have to keep to have a relationship, a life-giving relationship with God? Zero. The law didn't even exist then. But how about the Hebrew people? How much of the law did they have to keep in order to be delivered from their bondage in Egypt? Zero. God didn't say to them, if you keep my law perfectly for several hundred years, I'll come and deliver you. No. He simply delivered them by grace. And that's the way it is right through the Old Testament. You say, well, then what about that law thing? Oh. Grace is the way to God. Obedience is the walk with God. And that's exactly what the Apostle Paul says in the New Testament. He says, you've been saved by grace, so stop your stealing, stop your lying, stop your immorality, stop your dishonesty. Why? Because you have to? No. Because you love Jesus. And Jesus has transferred you from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. What we find in the Old Testament is it develops some major themes. And the New Testament assumes we've got those, so it doesn't have to repeat them, but it can supplement them. It can build on them so we get the whole picture. Let me give you a couple of examples. The Old Testament teaches us about a God who is transcendent. He is not this world. He is other than this world. Wow, that has tremendous implications. The New Testament says, did you get that? He is not this world. And guess what? The transcendent God has broken into this world, and He's with us. Now, if you don't know that God is transcendent, what's the big deal about Him being with us? He ought to be. We're nice people. The Old Testament teaches us that God is the Holy One. He is absolutely other in His character and His nature. He's awesome. The New Testament teaches us God is love. Now, if you don't know that the one who loves you is the Holy One, what's the big deal about Him loving you? He ought to. You're a lovable person, huh? The Old Testament teaches us that God is just. There is cause and effect in this world. You live in certain ways, you're going to reap certain results. The New Testament teaches us God is merciful. He says, I will forgive you for what you've done. I'll make a way through my Son. Now, if you don't know that He's just, what's the big deal about Him being merciful? One more. The Old Testament shows us that God saves us together as a people. People go to hell together, and people go to heaven together. The New Testament says, and guess what? You can know God personally. You can have an individual relationship with Him. Well, if you don't know that we are saved together, you believe, hey, it's just me, my, and mine. What happens to a church that doesn't know the Old Testament? A little, friendly God who lives under my bed to make my prayers come true. That's not Christian faith. That's not biblical faith. But it's very easy to have that if you don't know the Old Testament.